Alright guys, I'm here back with a new video, and in this video, I'm wrapping up my coverage of Big Brother 24 by finally getting around to doing my player ranking for the season. So, like in previous seasons, I'll be ranking every player from the season based on how I feel like they played on this individual season. So I got 16 players to rank here, let's get into it. At 16, the person I feel like played the worst game on this season does end up being Pooch. And Pooch is actually a person that, I actually don't think he is necessarily the worst player in the world. I mean, even though he is the first technical boots and completely did it to himself, where he isolates himself from the majority alliance and then proceeds to volunteer to go on the block in a position where he was already the main target anyway. Again, all that is really bad. But I will say there is one major positive for Pooch, even though with it comes a lot of ickiness, but he was a central figure in getting Taylor on the block in week 1. It was his campaigning to Daniel that got Daniel to agree to backdoor Taylor. So he is technically an effective player there, though the reasons he used contained a lot of microaggressions that were just not fun seeing be used as gameplay. But again, he is a person that had the backstage boss twist, which again should have given him a lot of power, being essentially gifted this power. And while he is initially thought of being brought into the majority alliance, he's eventually kicked out of that alliance in favor of Michael. And I think the fact that they didn't consider him a trustworthy person enough to want to keep him in the majority alliance, and he ends up being blindsided the following week, is all really bad. Now again, he did have a couple allies in Turner and Joseph that were actually loyal to him, though they just simply didn't have the numbers. And he did have the likes of Monty and Kyle campaigning for him, but at the end of the day, again, not much positive to really say about Pooch's game, considering he did a lot of it to himself. And because of that, for me, he's here at number 16. Now number 15, I'll say the next two were very difficult for me, as I think there's one player that is a lot more effective but goes home way earlier, and there's another player that makes it a bit deeper but also just did nothing in the game. So again, I didn't know exactly where to go here, but at 15, I did decide to go with Indy. And again, Indy made it a bit further in the game than a lot of other people will be talking about, but also, again, just really didn't do much in the game. I mean, while she was included in certain alliances like the Girls and the Five Swatters, and those were never really real alliances. And yes, she was going to be kept around as a number, but it was really just that, as a number. She never actively did much in the game, and even times that she did, she ends up failing at those things. She had a deal with Monty and Joseph, but that really went nowhere, and they were actually two of the bigger proponents for targeting her over Terence. And she also had no win equity in the game, where I think the only person she could possibly beat at the end is Terence, who she was on the block against in her boot week. Where again, there was a lot of talk about her not being there for the game and that she was there because she was a fan of Big Brother Brazil. And I do think that greatly tainted people's outlooks on her, to where I just do not see her ever getting the respect to win the game. So again, considering her near zero win equity, and then also her extremely passive gameplay style mixed in with her ineffectiveness in really anything, it does leave Indy as one of the worst post-jury boots in my eyes. To where again, if I were to redo the top 10 worst players to make jury, I do think Indy would crack that list. And for this list, she's obviously near the very bottom at number 15. Now, number 14, we're moving on to the player I debated with Indy about, and that person is Paloma, who is, again, technically the first boot of the season, though obviously leaves through very strange circumstances. Now, I will say the one major downside for Paloma, and the reason why I did consider putting her below Indy, is the fact that she was going to be the first boot anyway, where, again, she did quit the game, though even if she didn't quit the game, the backstage boss twist was in effect, to where more than likely Pooch would have picked her over Alyssa to go in against Taylor, and more than likely Taylor would have won the competition. So Paloma was probably on her way out anyway. However, in that sense, she would have been twist screwed. So I do feel like at the end of the day, I do feel like it feels right putting her above Indy, especially considering how active of a player she was. She was the most active player across the first week, creating the initial power structure, the power structure that holds in place for the following week after her boot. Mind you, also part of why she would have gone home from twist is because of her deteriorating mental health, to where because of that, I do think that caused Pooch to look at her as a more chaotic presence, to where I do think that is the reason why Pooch would have probably voted her in instead of Alyssa. So if that had not been the case, I do think Paloma had a closer relationship with Pooch up until that point, to where I do think at that point he probably voted in Alyssa, and Alyssa would have been the first boot instead. So, and there are a lot of weird factors with Paloma, but considering how much agency she had in the first week and putting together the initial power structure, and even though I don't think it would have held all the way through. Like, realistically, I don't know if Paloma would even make jury based on how I think the game would have played out anyway, but I do think her being there would have greatly increased the chances of the alliance sticking together for longer, and her untimely end here does leave her here at number 14. Now, number 13, we're jumping forward quite a bit, really being the only person near the end game to be this low on the list, but at 13, I do have to go with Terence. And this one's a bit of a debate for me. I think the main reason I'm putting Terence this low is because of win equity. At the end of the day, I do not think Terence could win the game. Despite me thinking around the time of Dire Fest that maybe there could have been a shift in perceptions of him, it did feel like even after Dire Fest, people were still looking at him as a complete GOAT. And I do think the fact that he had 0 win equity makes me feel justified in putting him this low. But even beyond that, obviously still played a very mediocre game. Where despite bonding with Daniel week 1 to the point where Daniel said night 1 that there's no way I'm putting up Terence, he ends up putting up Terence. And obviously alongside Taylor, Terence ends up becoming the perpetual pawn for the season. But even beyond that, had very little agency throughout a lot of the game. And when he did, he aligned with the people that were on the bottom. He aligned with the Daniels and Nicoles and stuck by them when they were having their downfalls. He threw the veto to try to save Daniel in a position where if he had been successful, he would have been the one going home. And obviously his antagonizing of Michael in his final week is obviously really bad as well. Now, again, I do think there is a glimmer of positivity for Terence. One, the fact that I do think he does effective work in his HOH to where, while initially it could have very much backfired, I'm at the point that Kyle exposes the leftovers. I do think him targeting Joseph was the correct move for his game at that point, though we do also see him get convinced by a wall yeller to put up Kyle, but again, he's still effective in getting rid of Joseph. And through that week, he does form the after party, which if the Kyle situation did not occur, the after party would have been in a very strong position to run the game after the fact, which again, like at the end of the day, does Terence win? No, he doesn't. So really it doesn't matter that much. But again, he did increase his chances of being in a better spot moving forward. And also, despite me saying all this, I actually do think out of the non-leftovers, outside of a couple people we will talk about a bit more, he did have one of the more accurate reads on the game. Though, to be fair, a lot of that did stem from information he was being fed by Daniel, to where he just continued to run with that information after the fact. But unlike the likes of the next person we'll be talking about, or even someone we'll be talking about way later, he did seem to have more of an awareness that there was an opposite side, that there was this majority alliance to face off against. So again, at least credit Terence there, but considering his near 0 win equity, his ineffectiveness in a lot of aspects of the game, and also his really just terrible attitude, I do have to land him here at 13. Now, number 12, we're moving on to another of the non-leftovers, but again, still probably not the people you're expecting. We do have Jasmine. And for me, I feel like Jasmine is just a step above Terence. I mean, I do think her win equity was, I guess, more, but like not by much. I do think she was a more active strategic player, even though, again, was largely ineffective in a lot of things that she was doing. But also, I will say that like before the leftovers broke up, Jasmine was actually in a decent spot. While not being included in the core of the power structure, she was still being tagged along with the likes of Amira and Alyssa in most things that they were doing, and had the likes of Daniel and Nicole wanting to work with her long term. And again, like she was actually in a solid position until the leftovers flipped the game. To which again, like she was one of the bigger targets for the leftovers after Daniel and Nicole. She does get saved during Taylor's HOH week because she's a black woman, and again, nothing due to what she was doing. And then following that, she is taken out the following week. It is a mostly mediocre game, but again, I do think there are a couple minor positives to point out here. One, I do think out of the non-leftovers to make jury, I do think she is probably the better strategic thinker of the bunch, which is extremely sad, but especially above like an Indy and Alyssa, I do think she was the strategic mind of that group. Though, to be fair, that also made her the biggest threat of that group. Also, I think she's one of the better liars on the cast. Though, again, like her overall treatment of Taylor was very icky across the season. Though she was effective in getting Turner to want to target Taylor at the beginning of week 3. So again, at least that's something positive from a game perspective as well. So again, it's a mixed bag, mostly negative, but there are some minor positives that do leave it here at number 12. Now, number 11, we probably have the player that most people have been waiting for out of the lower place people. We're at Daniel. And again, like I see a lot of people talk about how Nicole and Daniel are the worst players from this season. I really don't agree. I actually think Nicole and Daniel are the two best players outside of the leftovers after the Amira boot, where really the rest of the non-leftovers were really just chickens running around with their heads cut loose. The likes of Alyssa, Terence, Jasmine, Indy. It's like, what a terrible group of players there. None of which knew what was going on in the game. And while Nicole and Daniel, again, had major shortcomings and were also very unlikable people, they at least kind of knew what they were doing in the game. I mean, Daniel is someone that did have an accurate read on the house by the time he left. He did point out the entire Leftovers alliance and was making accurate pitches. The problem is that it was a bit too late by that point, though realistically, even in week 4, when he accidentally backdoors Nicole, which is a terrible move, obviously, but even in that move, he was almost right. He almost had the right read there. He was one person off. Like, the main issue there is that he assumed he had Kyle on his side, when in reality he didn't. And like, again, like what Daniel does in week 4 is him essentially trying to do what the Leftovers did in week 3. He's just a week late. Now, I will say again, like the massive negatives for Daniel, again, him backdooring Nicole, really bad. His treatment of Taylor, really bad. Not just from the actual treatment of it from a more personal standpoint, but also within the game, it loses him a lot of credibility. Where I would struggle to see Daniel winning a jury vote on this season unless he was against someone like the likes of Terence by the end of it. But again, outside of that, I think he's one of the better competitors on the season. I do think he has a competent strategic mind. It's just that, again, socially, he's a very mixed bag. He was left outside of the core power structure early on, despite the fact that he was HOH, which is a very rare feat in modern Big Brother. Though, to be fair, I do think some of that comes from his unluckiness that Paloma was a player that was extremely active and she wasn't scared of the HOH because of the fact that she couldn't be nominated. So I do think that definitely played a factor into things. But again, like Daniel, very middling game. Though I still think one of the better non-leftovers on the board. In my opinion, he's here at number 11. Number 10, same thing but slightly better. We have Nicole. Again, same thing. Unlikable presence, got very cocky, terrible treatment of Taylor. But Nicole has a couple major positives against Daniel. One is the fact that I do think she was the best position in the game before the Leftovers formed, to where she was number 1 on my power ranking coming into week 3. She was at the center of really everything. I mean, she was able to now bond with the girls. She had the pose pack. She had her alliance with Daniel, had relationships with really everybody in the house. Even Taylor thought that she was extremely close to Nicole. She had the Festy Bestie twist that greatly favored her at that point, and it really felt like everything was in the upward trajectory for Nicole until obviously the formation of the Leftovers that completely flipped the power structure, which at that point she becomes the biggest threat out of the non-Leftovers. And really, I think if it wasn't for the fact of the Festy Bestie twist, I do think Nicole probably goes home in week 3. So I do think a large reason why they don't target Nicole there is because Nicole is paired up with Taylor and they need Taylor's vote. I think if they were able to nominate the likes of Amira and Nicole together like they wanted to, I do think Nicole more than likely goes home there. And also, again, the final week is pretty bad. Again, despite her and Daniel having a mostly accurate read on the house, they still missed out on Kyle, and through that were dumb enough to let Nicole get backdoored there, which, again, the entire aspect of their conversation with Monty convincing them not to go through with his plan because they just assume that Monty must not have the votes is just ridiculous. And really just the hubris exuded by both Daniel and Nicole is obviously a massive downside for them. But again, for me, it's not anywhere close to the worst player of all time, not even the worst player on this season. Or again, the fact that she was in such a good position at one point in the game is better than you can say about most of the other people we just talked about. So because of that, for me, she's here at number 10. Now number 9, moving on to, again, another very similar case. One of the last non-leftovers on the board, we do have Amira. And again, Amira is the 3rd boot of the season. She gets 14th place on the season, yet I am putting her at number 9. Which, I mean, is kind of indicative of the season, really. And yeah, Amira, I still have flaws with Amira's game. I mean, if I were to redo my top 10 pre-jury boot, Amira would probably be on that list. Though I do think there are still some major downsides for her. I do think her threat management was completely off to where even before her eviction week, the men of the Oasis that weren't aligned with the post pack, the people like Joseph, Turner, and Pooch, were all wanting to target Amira, which I think really just shows you her mismanagement of her threat level there. She's also very loose with information, telling Monty that Taylor wants him out in a position where she was trying to convince Monty to keep Taylor around. And through that, I do think that does cause a fracture within the post-pack alliance as it makes Monty even more resolute and that they're not looking out for his best interests. So I think that stuff is bad, but I do think Amira's alliance building is very impressive. The fact that she was really in most of the alliances early on in the game. She was in the post-pack. She was in the girls, she was in old school. She was a central figure within all these alliances as well, where once Paloma leaves, she really starts to become the leader of that alliance, leading the strategy talks, with her and Nicole being the main reason why Pooch ends up going home in week 2, and seeming set to run the game, considering her positioning, but again, the formation of the leftovers completely flipped the power structure on her. Now again, I do think there is a bit of bad luck in the fact that they couldn't target Nicole, as again, I do think they would have gone for Nicole over Amira if they had the opportunity, but they didn't. Though either way, Amira still would have been the target probably the following round or the week after they got rid of someone like a Daniel. Like, Amira was still a massive target on the board for them, and I don't think there's a way for her to survive the pre-jury once the leftovers started to form. But again, her positioning before the leftovers cracked is extremely impressive. One of the most impressive positions that we see from a pre-jury boot across all of Big Brother US. So again, for me, I feel like that's something to be commended, even though I do have massive holes with her as a player, but she still lands here at number 9. Now at number 8, and we do have the last non-leftover on the board. We are talking about Alyssa. And Alyssa is a very strange player to right here. Again, I did debate of, is she above or below the Daniel, Nicole, Amira contingent, where I feel like those three are very closely tied together from a game standpoint to where I feel like they should be together. So for me, it was like, okay, is she like right above Jasmine, or does she leapfrog them to be at the top of the non-leftovers? And I did decide to go at the top. Not really because of anything that good about her game. I think it's mostly how deep of a run that she had, and also how close she got to staying, plus also her win equity at that point, where while I do think Alyssa only beats Brittany, she did get Brittany to want to keep her in that round. Also, Ozzy fails at getting her own quote-unquote best friend to keep her around, which is pretty bad. But so the fact that she was able to get Brittany to turn on Taylor is pretty impressive there. And also just obviously longevity of being in 5th place is obviously a factor here. But outside of that, I mean, Alyssa really did not play that good of a game. Now, she's another one of these players that was well positioned before the leftovers formed, where again, she was in all the alliances. She was in the same alliances that Amira was in, just obviously a lot less active a player within it. The issue is that she's also the reason why those alliances crumbled. Like, she is the reason why Pose Pack broke apart. She's the one that went to Kyle, told him about the girls, told him about old school. And through that is why the leftovers end up forming. I mean, she is really the reason why all of the games of the people we just talked about crumbled. But she's still able to survive way beyond those people. Now, again, technically, week 4, she was a target for a lot of the leftovers, to where he did want her out in order to guarantee that Michael and Brittany were safe, and almost does get backdoor there, where even Kyle was willing to let her go, though it is obviously the luck of Daniel and Nicole getting a misread from Monty at that point that ends up saving her. It was later her relationship does really save her in week 6, to where it is that once again she is the target there, which is obviously a negative, but it's her relationship with Kyle that causes the leftovers to finally crack, leading to Split House Week, where she does come out of that week in a decent position, where, like Terence, despite being on the bottom coming into the week, her getting rid of Joseph and then forming the after party should have put her in a really solid spot moving forward, to where after Kyle convinces Turner to flip on the leftovers, Alyssa should have been set for a deep run until obviously the Kyle stuff blows up, to where she's put on the bottom once again. But even then, still survives all the way to Final 5, where again, like, she almost stays. So again, it is a mostly middling game, but there are a couple good aspects of her game. And again, at the end of the day, like, I don't think she's necessarily the worst player in the world. I do think she has solid social relationships. The issue is obviously her being very passive strategically and kind of just being aloof for a lot of the game. But because of those things, for me, she's here at number 8. Now at number 7, and we're finally at the leftovers. Again, the leftovers had to be the top 7 for me. Really, I just felt like everyone outside of the leftovers were largely mediocre players. And truth be told, even the leftovers themselves are not that good of players. I mean, I think overall this is a season of very mediocre gameplay, to where even though the leftovers did do some impressive work in the mid game, I think everyone had massive holes in their game by the end of it. But let's start off at number 7. To me, the person that played the worst game out of the leftovers does end up having to be Brittany. Brittany is a very interesting case here, where again, I do think Brittany is a mostly self-aware player. She is a player that was aware of her jury perception, that she wouldn't be respected by the jury, and played up to that, which comes with some pros and cons. Obviously, the cons is the fact that she didn't really try to win the game. I think she recognized the fact that she had very little chance of winning the game. So through that, she instead plays for her next bus situation, which is getting Michael the win, but also coming in second place. And through that, obviously plays in a very chaotic way at points, especially towards the end game. But again, a lot of that stems from the fact that she really has nothing to lose at that point. She already knows that she's going to lose the game, so why not go all out in trying out all these different things to try to get you further into the game? Now, at the end of the day, again, it's still a losing game, and it was never going to be a winning game, which is why she is still at the bottom of the leftovers, where I think she is the only person in the leftovers that I could not see winning the game in really any scenario. I mean, even sitting at the end against Alyssa, which was her most optimal path by the end game, and again, she does end up voting to save Alyssa. One, I still don't even think she wins against Alyssa, but two, she was also doing it for the wrong reasons. She was doing it more so because she felt like Taylor wasn't taking her to Final 2 anymore, which she was. Again, that's not great. Her early game's also really bad. I mean, while she is included in the Girls Alliance, she instantly rats it out, trying to be in self-preservation mode due to the backstage boss twist, and instead ends up blowing up her own game. And following that, ends up becoming a pretty easy target after Taylor for most of the house, though obviously that situation never arises. And once the leftover forms, she is obviously working alongside Michael and is really there with Michael throughout a lot of his game, though obviously doesn't have the win equity that Michael has, and is still striving to go to the end with him, again, knowing that she will lose against him, but is okay with that. But along with that, obviously, comes the ickiness of them using the information against Kyle at a time that is most beneficial to them, which, again, is solid gameplay to a degree, but is obviously very morally gray there. And also, even beyond that, not even 100% great for their game. It is great in the short term of them getting rid of Kyle, but it definitely further harms their jury prospects. Though realistically, again, I don't think at the end of the day it would have mattered that much, but still not 100% an optimal move. Also, I think just in general, her jury management was very lacking, where outside of with Alyssa, I do think the way that she treated a lot of the jurors was really asinine. The likes of Indy and Jasmine, the fact that she was kind of scolding them on their way out. I mean, the way that she talks to Jasmine the day before she goes home and essentially blaming her for the reason that she's going home is just terrible jury management there. So again, I mean, it is a mostly bad game still, but I do think it is slightly better when you take it under context of her knowing that she's not going to win and her just trying to get second place, but even then is still not fully effective in that. To really where, again, like she tries to save Michael before the double and does effective work for the short term, but it doesn't end up sticking, and in turn it actually makes Brittany a bigger target moving forward, where now Monty and Taylor want to take her out in the following round. So again, that's not great either. So again, largely mediocre game by the end of it, and ends up being the worst of the leftovers here at number 7. Now number 6, and I will say I do think the top 6 here are all relatively close. For me, again, I do think this season was very much lacking in terms of a great player, and through that we have a lot of kind of good players that are kind of all around the same ballpark. And at number 6 here, I think this might be a little bit controversial considering how much this person is revered, but at number 6 I am going to put Joseph. And I did consider swapping this with the next person we'll be talking about, as I do think Joseph was a much more active player in the game. However, I also feel like Joseph was actively bad at a lot of points in the game. I mean, Joseph starts off the game in a very bad position where he is one of the people left outside of the core power structure, and through that is actually the backdoor target for about half the house in week 1, where the Girls Alliance, despite how much obviously they mistreated Taylor, they actually never wanted Taylor to go home. The plan was always to backdoor Joseph, but they couldn't convince Daniel of doing so. So Joseph was a massive target week 1, he then proceeds to be on the outs for week 2, being told the plan pretty late into the week. And in week 3, he's paired up with Monty in a position where Monty did that because he knew Joseph would go home over him. So all that is pretty bad. But then we get to the point where Joseph turns 25, and we get the leftovers formation, to which Joseph is one of the most integral figures in the creation of the leftovers. Again, personally, I would give Kyle the most credit out of anybody, but I do think Joseph is the next person, where Joseph is the person that probably did the most recruiting, where we do see a lot more of Joseph doing the ones-on-ones to tell people about the alliance. Now again, I think the initial formation was not as much due to him, but I do think he is the person that helped bring the pieces together. And from that point forward, he does a very effective job in lying to the other side and convincing him that he's not in the majority alliance, where even despite the likes of Daniel and Nicole recognizing that he's probably in with the other group, they still think of him as a potential swing. And we obviously see him form the 5 swatters, which further puts him in the middle. And I know a lot of people were praising him at this point in the game, but I still stand by this. I do not think this was that good of a move for him, largely because he is planning on going to the end of the leftovers. And really, that is the greatest flaw of Joseph as a player, is his blind loyalty, which again makes him a very likable person. But as a player, I do think his blind loyalty is the biggest flaw that he has, where because he was so loyal to the pound and so loyal to the leftovers, that makes all of his double dealing so much worse, because now he plans on going to the end of the leftovers in a position where most of the leftovers look at him as the person that's double dealing. They look at him as a person that is the least connected to the leftovers because he is making these other relationships with all these other people. He is looking out for himself, which isn't even necessarily the case, but that is the perception that is built from this. And really, I think that's a lot of what Joseph's game ends up being, is a lot of him doing things, but not recognizing the ramifications of those actions and how those things will be perceived. Where through him keeping these connections and really fighting to want the leftovers to allow him to keep these connections, it puts him in a position to where most of the leftovers looked at him as the first out, especially before Kyle didn't use the veto. Now, I will say that I do think week 6 had a level of impressive gameplay from Joseph to where he was able to completely run Taylor's HOH week. However, he ran it poorly. He wanted himself to get backdoored in a position where Michael and Kyle had already talked about the possibility of blindsiding Joseph. To where, do I actually think it would have gone through? Probably not. I do think Michael would have continued to try to play the middle. But, I mean, it was definitely a very precarious spot to be in. And really, again, only backs out of the plan because of the events of the veto, not actually due to him recognizing how terrible of a plan it is. But also, I do think there is some poor gameplay there in the sense that he doesn't target Alyssa from the beginning. I do think if he targeted Alyssa from the beginning, I do think Kyle would have been more accepting of this plan, where obviously he wouldn't be happy, but I do think he would have thrown the veto to just allow Alyssa to be booted there. But because he didn't go all in on targeting Alyssa, Kyle ends up winning the veto, and at that point is obviously refusing to take out Alyssa in that position. Also, I think how hard that Joseph campaigns against Alyssa at that point is obviously misguided as well, to where really it doesn't matter that much. And the fact that they're going all out on needing Alyssa out in that position just further fractures the leftovers at that point. And also the targeting of Indy over Terence is something to call out for Joseph as well, where he had a much better relationship with Indy. And we see this completely backfire in the following week, where Terence targets Joseph even over Monty, who had been talked about as the bigger target from the opposite side. So again, I think all this is like pretty poor play. It's like, while again, he does get a lot of control in that week to where he's able to steer Taylor wherever he wanted, it's all completely misguided in where he is steering her. And we also follow that with his final week, where he's taken out of the game, gets completely outplayed by Kyle, to where when Kyle leaks the leftovers, it just makes Joseph such an obvious target, especially due to his connections with the other side. But also, I mean, again, there's an element of him being screwed here that did make me think of putting him possibly higher. I mean, he is someone that was more than likely not going home that week. Again, if it was a normal week, Michael would be the HOH. I do not think Michael would have taken the shot at Joseph at that point. I do think he would have let Jasmine go home. And then really, who knows how the game plays out from that point forward, where I think after that, I do think Michael and Kyle would have targeted Joseph, but I do think he probably would have been safe for that week. Again, I think there's an element of him being screwed over as well, but really, as a whole, I do think his game is very middling. Now, I do think if he got to the end somehow, I do think he is a very likely winner. The jury did seem to respect him, where even Michael called him the best player of the jurors, which I do think probably shows that he was the second most respected player on the jury. But really, I think a lot of his gameplay up until that point is very middling, with a lot of actively bad play towards the middle of it, though he did have some shining moments, and because of that, for me, he is here number 6. Now, number 5, we have a person that is really only number 5 because he got 3rd place, and that person's Turner. And again, I said this in my review, I do not think Turner played that good of a game. I do think Turner is just such an extremely passive and moldable presence that he's just going to do whatever his closest ally wants him to do. I don't think Turner truly has a mind of his own. I think he just lets other people do the work for him. But again, that did get him very far into the game, where he did still have some win equity by the time of the final 5. But again, he starts the game off in a really terrible note, to where he's left out of the initial power structure. His reliance with Pooch even kicks Pooch out of the initial power structure. And despite all this, he is turning down alliances. Michael and Brittany want to form a final 3 with him. He turns them down for some reason. Ends up being fully loyal to the Oasis, which is a fake alliance. Loses his closest ally in Pooch in week 2. Proceeds to be the biggest target coming into week 3, but luckily ends up winning the HOH, which at that position, he's manipulated by Jasmine into targeting Taylor, a move that if he had been successful would have just led to him being the target again the following week. But that is when he gets extremely lucky in the fact that Kyle ends up deciding to form the leftovers with the information that he got from Alyssa. And again, it is the work of Kyle and Joseph that really do put the leftovers together, in a position where Turner still wanted to target Taylor at that point. He did not want to make the move. He was scared that by doing so, it would ruin his game, and talked about letting everyone else target Amira in the following week. It's not until they end up really strong-arming him by literally getting everyone into the HOH and just declaring themselves alliance that gets Turner to say, screw it, I guess I'll do it. And really, this ends up being one of his better moves of the season. I do think this move gives him a lot of respect, where it does make people think that he is a person that's standing up for what's right. And I do think he gains a lot of win equity in that position, only to then squander it moving forward. But he ends up playing pretty passively the following weeks. Again, he does build a final 2 with Kyle, which is a very important alliance, but really doesn't have much to do gameplay-wise up until week 6, to where at that point he doesn't want to get rid of Alyssa, despite the rest of his alliance being in on that plan at that point, though again is just willing to let it happen because that's Turner for you. But it's not until Kyle fights back against it that Turner ends up backing him up. And then we get to the split house week, where at that point Terence looked at Turner as one of his closest allies, and through that picked him to be in Dire Fest with him so that he can have a close confidant, only for Kyle to convince Terence to put up Turner anyway, to where Turner would have probably been the boot had Joseph won the veto, though to be fair, who really knows what Terence was thinking by that point. But again, this is another situation where Kyle easily convinces him to flip on the leftovers, and they end up forming the after party, which was actually a pretty decent spot for Turner, to where at that point, this is actually probably the highest win equity he has of the entire season, having a Final Four alliance with all people that he is going to beat. He 100% beats Terence at the end. I'm pretty sure he beats Alyssa, and based on the way the jury was talking, I'm pretty confident he would beat Kyle at that point as well, considering how anti-Kyle the jury was even before the stuff about him was leaked. So that is probably the highest amount of win equity that he has, but despite that, he still decides to want to target Alyssa and Terence the following round when he wins HOH, and it's not until Kyle again convinces him to not do so, again a move that is in his best interest, that he ends up doing it. And they do obviously come up with a plan to backdoor Michael, but even then, that is the point where we do see him and Monty start to rebond. But even then, Kyle convinces him to backdoor Monty once Michael wins the veto, which he would have done until the point where the Kyle information comes out, to which we have, again, a move that feels weird because obviously it's based around more real life situations, but it's a terrible move gameplay wise for him to backdoor Kyle, and he gets rid of his closest ally in a position where his closest ally is also one of his biggest lock win scenarios as well, and essentially replaces Kyle with Monty, a person that will beat him at the end. So again, that's obviously a negative trade-off for Turner there. And from that point forward, again, I just feel like Turner ends up being a very middling jury threat, to where I do think the likes of Michael, Taylor, and Monty all beat him pretty handily, to where I think he only beats the likes of Brittany, Alyssa, and Terence, and even then, I think Alyssa might be a bit rocky, but he then proceeds to vote out Terence and target Brittany from that point forward. And it's again another situation where he is strong-armed by Monty into taking out Michael in a position where he really did not want to do so, despite it again being the best move for him. And again, it's funny that up until this point, it's like he continuously gets strong-armed by his allies into doing moves that are in his best interest, only to lead up to the Final 5, where he's finally strong-armed into doing a decision that isn't in his best interest. Where at the Final 5, he does agree to vote out Alyssa over Taylor, a really asinine move, making it so that, one, he loses the respect of Alyssa, also gets rid of Alyssa, someone that was willing to take him to the end, also makes it very likely that he gets the end with Monty or Taylor, two people that will absolutely slaughter him in a jury vote. It really is an absolutely asinine move, and we follow that up with obviously the rest of the game playing out in a way that has Brittany evicted at 4, and he's essentially drawing dead at the final 3. And even then, couldn't even convince his closest ally to take him, despite the fact that his closest ally wins against him while he loses in the other situation. Again, it is really a largely mediocre game that, again, I'm only putting on number 5 here, mainly because he got 3rd place and he had win equity by the time of the final 5. But again, considering how passive of a game he played and how warped his game view was, I do have to leave him here at number 5. Now, number 4, moving on to a player that I think is probably one of the hardest players to rank of this entire season, and that person is Kyle. And straight up, I do think Kyle is one of the most integral players to the game for the first 2/3 of it. Really, up until his boot, I think Kyle is probably the most influential player of the season. I do think he is the one that dictated a lot of what happened in this game, though obviously with that comes a lot of pros and cons. Kyle is a player that at one point should have been poised to straight up just dominate the game, facing no adversity, but instead messes up the game for himself, which makes him a very mixed player in my eyes. Again, he is a player that is initially put into the main power structure, put into the Pose Pack Alliance while also having the Oasis. While he does try to save Pooch ineffectively in week 2, he is able to gain information from Alyssa about the formation of the girls and old school that allows him to spread this information to the remaining members of the Oasis to where they eventually obviously form the Pound. And through that end up creating the plan for the leftovers. Again, this is something I would fully give Kyle credit for. I do think Kyle is the most integral person to the creation of the leftovers, being the one to get the information to form the alliance, being the center of the strategy talks when talking about the formation of the alliance, and also positioning himself the best within that alliance, where through the creation of this alliance, again, he has the Pound, this 4-person alliance. He also ends up bringing in Michael and Brittany, who he already had a final 3 with at that point, and also brings in Taylor, someone that is closer to the Michael and Brittany side of things, which essentially puts him in the middle position, where he has two sides that on paper should be going after each other while he's able to stay in the middle when the leftovers eventually explodes. Also, he ends up building a final 2 with Turner while also having a very strong relationship with Monty at this point in the game. Or again, he is perfectly positioned within the leftovers. And again, that is something I will give him most of the credit for. However, I do think week 4 is where his game starts to really crumble. Starting off with the fact that he, for some reason, wants to cut Alyssa, where despite him having a showmance with Alyssa, he looks at Alyssa as more of a distraction than an asset to his game, which is such a warped way of looking at it. To where at that point he decides to campaign against Alyssa, trying to get his own alliance to take out Alyssa, only for their showmance to further blossom through this week to where he ends up regretting it. But already the damage was done to the point where his campaigning against Alyssa ends up being used against him moving forward, where they use the exact same talking points that Kyle brought up in this round against him. But again, he was willing to let Alyssa go during this week. It's not until Daniel decides to use the veto that everything ends up changing. And we get to week 5, where again, this is where we get the Cookout 2.0 comments. And I said this already, it's like, I think the initial thought makes sense considering where we just came from. However, the fact that he enacted his game as if this was a reality is the issue. The fact that he isolates Monty, someone that looked at him as his solid final 2 up until this point, pretty much solely because of this misguided notion of thinking Monty is in a all POC alliance, is obviously very icky. You also have him trying to gather what ends up being all the white people, which again, I said this already also, that the alliance that he wants to form makes sense. The issue is that he did bring race into it, where if he didn't bring race into it, again, the pieces make sense. He has a final 3 with Michael and Brittany already from way earlier in the game. He already had a final 2 with Turner, and obviously he has his showmance with Alyssa. Like, all these separate pieces coming together makes sense for his game. The problem is the fact that he obviously brought race into it. But then his game obviously further starts to crumble in week 6, to where at that point he wins the veto under the assumption that Joseph is going to be backdoored, only to then be told that Alyssa is going to go on the block instead, to where obviously he fights against it, which again, I don't have an issue with that. It is ridiculous that they even thought that he was going to let Alyssa go on the block. However, again, like, them campaigning against Alyssa here is using a lot of the same points that Kyle made in week 4, which is essentially using his own words against him there. And really, he should have been doing more work to protect Alyssa coming into that week instead of just letting her being targeted. But obviously that leads to him being now on the bottom of the leftover alliance, to where essentially he ends up switching positions with Michael and Brittany. But even despite that, he's able to recover the following week, where he does very impressive work in leaking the leftovers to Alyssa and Terence, convincing Terence to put up Joseph and Turner. And while he does end up being put on the block by the end of the week, Joseph was always going home there. Taking out Joseph was such a great position for Kyle to be in, especially when he solidifies the after party. Which again, at that point, especially after Turner ends up winning the following HOH, it should have put Kyle in a pretty solid position moving forward. where again, like we see Kyle convince Turner to keep with that alliance, target Michael. Once he gets unlucky with the fact that Michael wins the veto, they obviously want to backdoor Monty. That probably would have gone through. However, this is when all of his game gets blown up, obviously. And again, this is all him facing the ramifications of the ickiness that he displayed a few weeks ago, and also the just really bad reads on the game. It's where it all finally comes back on him. But it's still a very weird circumstance in the way that he goes out, to where again, he gets taken out by his closest ally. And obviously he doesn't handle this information well initially, but it's like at the end of the day, his game was done at this point. It doesn't really matter. And really just obviously gives up in the game by the time he's backdoored. But again, like even then, like his win equity at this point was still pretty low. Like while again, I do think he was the most active player up until this point, had a lot of control over how the game played out, he was also still a pretty big goat from the jury's point of view. I don't think there's any way that Joseph would have given him his vote at the end. I do think the likes of Indy and Jasmine were unlikely to vote for him as well. And really, I think Kyle was pretty much drawing near dead from a jury vote perspective. So, I mean, there's a lot of negatives to point out with Kyle's game, but for me, the activeness that he had in his game and the effectiveness he had at points is enough for me to land him here at number 4. Now, number 3, and this was a tough one. My number 2 and number 3 were flipping around a bit. However, at 3, I am going to go with Monty. And I will say Monty's third place placement here is largely due to the outcome of the season. I do think the fact that he takes Taylor to the end and proceeds to lose to her when he had the very clear winning scenario of taking Turner to the end, I do think is a massive indictment on his game, to where he is knocked down to 3, where I think even before that there was a debate for him being number 1. But again, I just feel like that alone is just such a bad look for his game. A game that as a whole is just a very average Big Brother game. It is a game that, like, early on, he's initial put into the main power structure, though again, tries to save Pooch, fails at that, ends up being kind of on the bottom of the post pack by the end of that week, and is ready to flip on the post pack. Obviously, the Festy Bestie twist ends up bringing them back together, but again, through the information that Kyle ends up leaking, they decide to finally flip on the post pack officially and create the leftovers, which I will say, I do think out of the Pound members, Monty is probably one of the least integral in executing this plan. Again, I do think it is Kyle that was the mastermind of the creation of the leftovers. I think Joseph was one of the more active participants in getting everything together. Monty was more so just there. I mean, he was the person that approached Taylor first and alluded to her about it. But outside of that, I mean, I do feel like it was the others that did more of the work there. But still, it is a position that does greatly benefit him. And he does win the following HOH, to where we do get some of his failings. To where he obviously wants to backdoor Nicole initially, but isn't able to convince Taylor to give him the go-ahead on doing it. We have him then switching his mind to wanting to backdoor Alyssa, only for him to tell Nicole and Daniel about this plan, only for them to not believe him and instead end up forcing him to backdoor Nicole anyway. Which I do think this entire situation and the way that Monty uses the information that he got from the likes of Alyssa, Jasmine, and Indy and telling Nicole and Daniel about it ends up leading to him being exposed. That causes the non-leftovers to directly come for Monty moving forward. Which is where, from that point forward, Monty really starts to play a lot more passively. I mean, there really isn't much that he does across week 5, kind of being resolute in him sticking with the leftovers. But then we get to week 6, where again, like, he's one of these people that is just so resolute in getting rid of Alyssa, which, I mean, again, is not a bad move on paper. But again, once Kyle has the veto, I think all you're doing is burning your relationship with Kyle. Now, coming into the split house week, he was the secondary target for Michael, to where he is picked to be on Michael's side as a backup in the case that Jasmine wins veto. So I will say that through a lot of this, there is some level of decent threat management here, to where through his more passive play at this point, in Joseph's more active play, Joseph does become the target over Monty throughout a lot of this. To where that is why Terence ends up picking Joseph over Monty when he essentially had to pick one as a target. Now, I do think during this HOH week, Monty has some pretty suboptimal play by openly talking about targeting Michael when, again, Michael is the HOH. So that was poor play there. The following week, I do think he has some solid work in getting back in with Kyle and Turner, though obviously it doesn't stick to the point where Kyle still wants to backdoor Monty after Michael wins the veto. So again, that doesn't go through due to the leaking of the Kyle situation, which comes with some pros and cons. Obviously, he gets saved due to something completely out of his control. However, he also kind of gets saved by Michael and Brittany leaking the information, which that stems from them not wanting to lose Monty at this point in the game. So again, it is kind of a mixed bag there. The following week, I do think it's impressive that Michael doesn't target either Monty or Turner, and instead decides to target Terence, which was a pretty suboptimal move for Michael in that position. And really, I think this is probably the most impressive part of Monty's game are these middle rounds here, where despite the fact that he was directly targeting Michael for a lot of this stretch of the game, Michael still wants to keep him around. And I do think that is something to be commended from Monty, even though by the end of the week 7 round, he does make the gentleman's agreement to keep Michael, and it has to be reassured by Taylor that the women aren't working together, to the point where he decides to flip back on that agreement. And we get to a double eviction where, again, I fully give him credit for convincing Turner to go against Michael. Again, we see that Turner was very against the plan, but Monty essentially forces him to do it, which, again, credit to Monty there. And really from that point forward, he steamrolls the game. I mean, he is safe from Final 6 on. He wins Final 6 veto, Final 5 HOH, Final 4 veto, Final 3 HOH. He wins every competition from that point forward, positions himself very well coming into the Final 3. So he gets rid of the other 2 goats, making it less likely that his other Final 2s and Taylor or Turner are not going to take him to the end. As at that point, why risk breaking your deal to Monty when you could just lose to the other person as well? Though again, along the way, I do think Monty has some pretty terrible jury management with the likes of Brittany in particular, where I think he completely isolates Brittany and loses her jury vote through that. And again, makes the really dumb decision at the end to cut Turner to take Taylor, only then lose against Taylor in a position where he would have won against Turner, probably in a near unanimous vote. So again, like, it's all a pretty mixed bag. Again, there are definitely very impressive elements of his game, though again, I feel like that final decision is just so asinine. And when mixing that in with the fact that he gets saved week 8 due to a lot of things that were outside of his control, and was also a pretty massive target in the middle section of the game, to where if it wasn't for the Festy Bestie twist and him getting very favorable comp results, I do think he would have been a potential boot at that point in the game. And also being ineffective early on in the game, to where despite being in the majority, he wasn't getting his way. So again, it's a lot of very middling stuff. But I do think he was the most integral player to deciding how the end game played out. And for that, for me, it lands him here at number 3. Now, number 2, moving on to, again, a player that I decided to leapfrog Monty on the list due to Monty's terrible final decision, and also due to how much the jury propped this person up, and that person is Michael. And again, Michael, I do think on paper is probably the best player of the season. I do think he is the player that I would have the most faith in any given Big Brother season, where he does seem to be the most strategically sound, and obviously is very good at competitions and is good enough socially, and did seem to have a lot of respect from the jury, to where, again, in the interview before the finale, when each of the jurors were asked who played the best game, they all said Michael. So that is obviously something to be commended. Now, I think he starts off the game a bit rough, being the initial target for Daniel, though even before he wins the veto, he is approached to join Paloma's alliance, which already puts him in a decent spot there, to where he more than likely would have survived the block even if he was still on the block at that point. Though he does end up winning the veto, and obviously starts his really insane comp run across the season. He also has an alliance with Brittany from very early on, though it's obviously very sketchy of her early on because of how chaotic of a figure she is, but that ends up being one of his strongest relationships across the season. Also builds a bond with Taylor, to where by week 2, he solidly wants to work with her, but does decide to leave her on the block in week 2. But again, coming into week 3, we see the post-pack start to crumble, and we do see Michael playing both sides. And really, I think Michael's playing of both sides across the season ends up being a massive element of his game, to where he spends so much of his game trying to actively play both sides, which can be a pro and con at points. But eventually, when the leftovers starts to become a formal thing, he decides to jump on board, along with Brittany and Taylor, and forming a final 3 with them essentially being one side of the leftovers. Again, all the people that are not in the pound in that alliance, but through that, end up being kind of in opposition to the other side when they eventually get to 7, with Michael being the biggest target on the board, which essentially puts him at the bottom of the leftovers at this point. Which is why moving forward, we do see Michael doing a lot of active work in trying to position himself more so in a middle position. And again, I will say that I do think in reality, Michael is actually a pretty passive player, as we do see later in the game. I do think one of Michael's biggest issues is the fact that he is too passive of a player. However, I do think he is a player that when forced to, he will play actively. And I do think that is what we saw through a lot of the seasons, the fact that he was on the bottom of most of the groups that he was put in, and through that put a lot more active work. And we do see that with the leftovers, where we do see him do good work in week 4 and trying to convince the rest of the leftovers to target Alyssa, as that would cause Indy Indy to join Michael and Brittany, which would essentially guarantee them safety, which would have been a very impressive move if he had been able to do it, but obviously Daniel messed that all up. Week 5, we have Kyle approaching Michael about Michael winning HOH and targeting Daniel as a very easy target, though there is some talk about targeting Monty, which I don't think would have been the best move for him at this point. Though I do like how he approaches this week, where again, a lot of it comes down to him initially targeting Monty, again, due to the fact that Monty kept on bragging about how great of relationships he had with the likes of Indy and Jasmine, only for Indy and Jasmine to approach him about targeting Monty, which made him recognize that, oh, Monty is actually not a threat, so I'm not going to target him. But this is also where Kyle approaches him about the Cook 2.0 comments, which is where, again, it gets a bit icky, the fact that Brittany and Michael end up holding this back at this point, which is beneficial to their game. And again, from a pure game perspective, obviously it does make sense, though obviously it does come with some moral ambiguity there. But I do think his game really shines in week 6, where at that point he is essentially fully weaponizing Kyle, and Kyle started distrust in a lot of the leftovers in order to fracture the leftovers, where it is Brittany actually that initially creates the plan of taking out Alyssa. And again, Michael and Brittany fully utilize this as a way to fracture the leftovers to where now they are in the middle instead of Kyle. To where again, the leftovers had been set up to where Kyle was in the center up until this point, but through this fracture, now Kyle ends up being targeted by the likes of Monty, Joseph, and Taylor, to where they essentially become a side in opposition to Kyle, to where now Michael and Brittany are in the middle, which ends up being very impressive work there, even though it doesn't fully hold. But again, split house week, solid play there, keeping the status quo and taking out Jasmine. Again, talks about taking out Monty, but never really too much. Though I do think week 8 is where we get some more haziness, to where again, this is where Michael is the backdoor target. Kyle completely outplays him here. Michael was going home had the veto been won by literally anybody else. So Michael had to be very lucky in the sense that he had to be picked for the veto, and also he had to win it, which he obviously ends up doing. But through this, and this would eventually lead to Monty becoming the new target, to which I do think at this point that would have been the better move for Michael to just let Monty go. And Monty obviously ends up becoming his downfall moving forward, and had been this presence that Michael had always considered taking out but just never pulled the trigger. And I do think at this point this would have been the time to do it. But instead he decides that Kyle is actually his biggest threat, and decides to finally utilize the information he has on Kyle to take Kyle out of the game. And I'm again of two minds on this. Obviously, I think from a pure game perspective, his effectiveness is undeniable. Now, I do think at the end of the day, he also needed the backing of the rest of the house in order to fully pressure Turner into going through with this, but he ends up putting this information to good use. But again, the fact that it is this information, which really crosses beyond the game, is what makes this very, very icky. Again, essentially feeling like he's weaponizing racism in order to progress his game. Or again, he had previously, when hearing about these thoughts from Kyle initially, thought that this was a good thing for his game in the sense that it separated Kyle from the rest of the leftovers, and then again weaponized that into splitting Kyle from the rest of the leftovers. But for him to just now demonize this information when it's beneficial to his game, I do think is definitely an icky aspect of all of it. But again, is effective in getting rid of Kyle. While also I do think an unstated element of this is that I do think by doing this, this also harms his perceived jury potential, to where again, the likes of Terence and Monty talk about never awarding Michael the win because of how icky this feels. However, I don't feel like that actually truly affected the jury. So I feel like the jury was always going to vote for Michael, to where while this can be a negative, I do think it actually works to his favor, to where it actually makes Monty less threatened by him moving forward, though obviously still not enough to not target him by the end of it. But again, to me, it is the following week where Michael's game really starts to crumble. I mean, no matter what, Michael was already a big target by this point and needed to win out. However, the fact that he doesn't go all in on this notion is definitely a flaw. I think he should have been taking out the likes of Turner and Monty in order to increase his chances of being able to win out from that point forward, but instead decides to keep them around. And again, it could have potentially worked out for him because of the work of Brittany, to where through all of Brittany's work, it causes Monty and Turner to be worried about an all-women's alliance, to where they make the gentleman's agreement with Michael, but again, that doesn't stick by the very end of the week. And we do have his eventual eviction, which I will say, like, at least he tried. I mean, at least he went all out there. And while I don't think he even had the correct approach, I think he should have outed the gentleman's agreement in order to try to further solidify Taylor and Alyssa. At the end of the day, I don't think it would have been effective anyway. So again, like, it's a bit of a rough game. I mean, it's a game that by the end of it, he definitely needed to win out. But I think considering the fact that he was adored by the jury still and was probably the second most active player up until that point outside of Kyle, I do think there is a lot of positive here, especially considering I do feel like he probably beats everyone by the end outside of maybe Taylor. And because that for me, he is here number 2. And at number 1, again, I just said her name. We do have the winner of the season. We do have Taylor. And Taylor is such an interesting case here. And I do think the fact that Taylor is number 1, despite my issues with her game, really just shows you, again, like the fact that I don't look too highly on a lot of the players of this season. But even despite that, I do think Taylor was probably the most consistent player across the season. To where, despite her HOH week being a massive outlier in that, and then her obviously being in bad positions at points, I don't think she actively plays poorly for a lot of the game. On week 1, I mean, again, she's targeted already due to this bias against her. But even despite that, a lot of the women that were anti her still wanted Joseph out instead of her. And yes, she was on the block and she was going to get evicted, and that's definitely something to knock against her. But really, I feel like a lot of the season still plays out the same due to the nature of the twist, even if Paloma didn't end up quitting there. But again, still would have been in a position where she was saved by a twist. Week 2, I do feel like she has a bit of a mixed bag of a game. I do think she has some impressive elements of her game in the sense that she's willing to be used as a pawn, and she starts to build relationships with the women to where they are more willing to keep her in the game because they look at her as a potential weapon moving forward to target the likes of the men, while also not actually wanting to do so. Like, she doesn't want to win competitions moving forward. She openly says that to the camera, which actually I think that's a mixed bag of a thing in itself. Like, where I do think for her, she probably should have been trying to get power to gain some more leverage in the game. But at the end of the day, it's like, yeah, she would have just been doing the dirty work for other players. So I do think that as a whole is overall a net positive in the sense that it does want the women to keep her around early on in the game and want to target Pooch. But even by the end of the week, once the men realize that Pooch are going home, they realize that they can use Taylor as a weapon as well, to where we do see the likes of Monty and Kyle talk about keeping Taylor around at that point to potentially target the other women. Though I will say a major downside of this week until that point where the men decide to change their minds is the fact that she was very openly targeting Monty in particular, to where that did lead to Monty really going all out and trying to campaign against her for most of the week. But again, it all works out for her by the end of it. But then we see week 3 where she gets very unlucky in the fact that the Festy Bestie twist comes into play, to where at that point that gets the post pack to come back together for the short term, to where they decide to target Taylor once again as a very easy target. However, again, it is the formation of the leftovers that does end up saving her, which again, I mean, this is definitely something I do think is partially luck on her end. Like, obviously, if it wasn't for Kyle and Joseph deciding to fully go through with this, she probably just goes home this week. I do think Turner still was very willing to let Taylor go home, but it was through the strong arming that Kyle and Joseph did that made Turner go along with the leftovers. And again, I do think week 4, it was suboptimal play for her to not want to go on the block at that point to get rid of Nicole, as at that point, going on the block and getting rid of her partner as quickly as possible would have been the most beneficial move for her to do so before more fractures were created within the leftovers. But again, it's such a minor disparity there. But at this point, I mean, she really is one of the best positioned players in the game. To where really, outside of Kyle and Turner, she's probably the best positioned out of the leftovers at that point, with no one really coming for her. Where again, the likes of Kyle and Michael are talking about targeting Joseph and Monty when they get down to 7, while the likes of Monty and Joseph are talking about targeting the likes of Michael and Brittany. So, like, really, no one was targeting Taylor for a good chunk of this middle section of the game. However, again, we got to talk about her HOH week, which I just think was really terrible. I think her instantly talking about using her own alliance members as pawns is really asinine. And yes, I know that there is talk about, like, oh, it's a bit rationalized by the fact that they just come out of the Festy Bestie twist where they had been using their own allies as pawns. But again, for her to not recognize that the end of the Festy Bestie twist means that they need to stop that is still pretty bad from my point of view. But, and she targets Terence. They don't get rid of Terence. They instead get rid of Indy. And also, obviously, along the week, she wants to get rid of Alyssa, also ineffective in getting that through, while also burning her relationship with Turner, to where Turner's upset by the fact that she wanted to use him as a pawn to begin with. Obviously, burns her relationship with Kyle, to where Kyle is now directly coming after Monty, Joseph, and Taylor. Mind you, again, Taylor's probably the less likely boot of those 3 if Kyle did end up going through with that. Though the week did obviously further solidify her bond with Joseph, but overall I do feel like it was a net negative. However, I feel like it's from this point on, I do feel like Taylor really plays pretty optimally. I don't think there's really a point in the game from this point forward where I have a major issue with how Taylor played, despite certain things going wrong for her. Where obviously we have the split house week, where through that week, that's where she starts to build her bond with Monty, which obviously ends up being a very important relationship for her moving forward, and ends up having a pretty easy week in getting rid of Jasmine. The following week, again, she is targeted at a point. They do put up her and Brittany, with her being the target in the case that the nominations stay the same, though to be fair, that was never really happening, as everybody but Michael would have used the veto to take out Michael, and Michael winning the veto would have always led to Michael using the veto on Brittany to where Monty would have been backdoored. So it's like, no matter what, Taylor was probably safe that week, though it is obviously a low point for her endgame. Though again, I don't think she plays that week poorly at all. I mean, moving forward, after that week, she's back in a pretty solid position. No one is targeting her. She now has an even further solidified bond with Monty. Still has Michael and Brittany in her corner. I guess like maybe Turner would have come after her, but like I don't even really think so for the following round at least. So I do think she was in a solid spot at that point. Final 7 round, she is the person that go to Monty to reassure him that there is no all-women's alliance, to where it gets Monty to get back on track with wanting to take out Michael. And at this point, it seemed like Taylor was the person that stayed on track with wanting to get rid of Michael the entire week, while other people were fluctuating, leading up to the eventual Michael eviction, which I think was probably the perfect timing for her. I think if it was any earlier, I would say it's too early to get rid of Michael, considering Michael was mostly loyal to Taylor. Though I do think at Final 6 was probably the right time. Though she is in a bit of danger at Final 5, though a lot of that is due to very unlucky veto circumstances. I think she gets very unlucky that Brittany is the one that wins the veto, where obviously by this point, her and Monty had a Final 2, and also had a Final 2 with Turner. Monty, Turner, and Taylor make a Final 3 at this point as well. And Turner was very resolute in getting rid of Brittany. So I do think by the fact that Brittany winning the veto here, putting Taylor against Alyssa on the block, was probably the worst case scenario for her, where at this point, Turner should have voted out Taylor. He really should have. And the fact that he doesn't is obviously a major indictment against him. But I will say that again, like minor knock on her for losing the trust of Brittany. And a lot of that does stem from her not spending as much time with Brittany, her spending more time with Monty. That is definitely an issue, though. Considering how locked in Turner was, and a lot of that being due to how much Monty wanted to keep Taylor around, it kind of is a double-edged sword there. But again, Final 4 on, I think she's pretty much locked in with Monty. I mean, it's pretty much a foregone conclusion that her and Monty are going to be the final 2. Now, again, she is ineffective in getting Monty to vote out Turner over Brittany, though, again, like, that was never going to happen anyway, but is still able to keep Monty on her side at the Final 3, getting him to take her to the end, despite the fact that she just demolishes him in a jury vote. And really, I think a lot of the more impressive elements of Taylor's endgame here is the fact that she manages her threat level extremely well, making it so that the likes of Monty and Turner don't recognize how big of a threat she can be by the endgame, despite the fact that Alyssa was someone that was openly talking about how much of a threat Taylor would be in a jury vote. And to be fair, part of this is because Taylor herself seemed to think that Monty would beat her at the end, and also seemed to believe that like Turner was the biggest jury threat. So it's not even like Taylor herself had the most accurate read of how the jury would vote. But the fact that she does downplay her threat level to the point where Monty just severely underestimates her is definitely an impressive element of her game. And again, going through her game week to week, it definitely sounds like the games of Michael or Monty are more impressive, with them having more control over how the game played out. And that is true. I do not think Taylor had that much control over how the game played out. But again, when it comes to this player ranking here, in terms of how they played on this season, it's not really about the amount of control Taylor had, and more so about the impressiveness of her game. Again, like the fact that she starts off the game on such a low, again, she was supposed to be the first evicted, and goes from that to end up becoming one of the biggest jury threats on the board, persevering through the game despite all this adversity, with only winning 2 HOHs along the way, 2 HOHs that she didn't even need, and 2 HOHs that she didn't even get much power from, considering she doesn't even get her target out either of those HOHs. It is impressive how she was able to overcome the amount of adversity that she faced across the season, and still having people that wanted to take her to the end, despite knowing that the story that she had was a really incredible one here. So I think mixing that in with the fact that, again, like I do think overall this is a very middling group of players. I think anyone on this season played a particularly great game. I think through that, I do have to give the number 1 placement to the winner here. Where if this had been a situation where they had been another player that had just completely steamrolled the entire game, only to lose the jury vote, like in a way that like a Tyler or a Paul or someone to that nature had, then would I put Taylor at number 1? No. But again, we didn't have that figure on this season. There is no one on this season that played a truly great game. And because of that, and also the very minimal downsides I have for Taylor's game outside of the initial bias that was put against her that severely weakened her game position to begin with, and the fact that she was able to rise above that largely due to her incredible social game that allowed her to win back these jury members that had these biases against her. I do feel like at the end of the day, Taylor has to be here at number 1. But there we go. I mean, that is my player ranking for Big Brother 24, the conclusion to my coverage of the season. Now, moving forward, obviously, I am still covering Survivor 43, and I'll do a review of The Amazing Race 34 as well when that ends. I will also be covering BB 25 next year, so stay tuned for that. Also, again, I mentioned I want to do some bigger Big Brother rankings before BB 25, so those will be coming within the course of the next year. And outside of that, just stay tuned for the same type of videos that you can expect from the channel. But for now, that is the video. Thank you for watching.